Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're going to unpack a framework that honestly completely changes how we look at our daily work lives. We are diving straight into Carl Weick's organizational information theory. This is our lens for today, and it's just a truly brilliant way of understanding workplace communication. When we normally think about a company, we usually picture the physical building, right? The rows of desks, or maybe a really strict corporate hierarchy. But Weich's theory asks us to just throw that physical picture completely out the window. Instead, it proposes that an organization isn't a physical place or a chart at all, it's essentially a massive ongoing conversation. The organization is the flow of information itself. And the moment that information stops flowing, well, the organization basically ceases to function. Let's dig into exactly how this works. So I want you to think about your typical workday for a second. Imagine opening your inbox and finding a really vague, frantic email from your boss that simply says, "Let's pivot the strategy immediately," with absolutely zero context attached. What do? Do you scrap the entire project? Do you just change the font on a presentation? The sheer panic and chaos of that moment is exactly what this theory addresses. How do companies actually survive confusing information? How do human beings organize themselves to make sense out of daily data that is chaotic, tangled, and completely ambiguous? Well, Carl Weick developed this theory specifically to answer that exact question. He realized that the primary job of any organization isn't just to produce a product or deliver a service. No, the fundamental job is to make sense of the chaos so that the actual work can get done. Okay, let's lay out our roadmap for this explainer so you know exactly where we're headed. We'll break this down into 5 quick parts. First, making sense of chaos. Second, the information environment. Third, principles of equivocality. Fourth, the 3-stage process. And fifth, evaluating the theory. Let's kick things off with Section 1, making sense of chaos. Now, what's really interesting here is how traditional business theories operate. They usually get incredibly bogged down in the rigid structure of the organization. They obsess over who reports to whom, the formal hierarchy, the different departments, the official titles. But think back to that vague "let's pivot" email from the CEO we just talked about. When a crisis hits or when confusion strikes, that rigid org chart on the wall becomes virtually useless. Organizational information theory ignores that static structure entirely and focuses completely on the dynamic, active process of managing information. It's all about how members spontaneously organize themselves, reaching across departments, starting group chats, jumping on quick calls, just to handle a sudden influx of data. In this view, organizing is a living, breathing process. It's a verb, not a noun. The organization is simply the ongoing act of people coming together to make sense of things. Moving right along to Section 2, the information environment. Weick's theory is built on 3 core assumptions. You can think of these as the foundational laws of physics that dictate why human organizations have to process information in the first place. First, human organizations exist in an information environment. Just like fish swim in an ocean of water without even thinking about it, modern organizations are literally drowning in a sea of information. Think of the endless Slack notifications, Jira tickets, Zoom calls, and email threads you're navigating every single day. Second, the information an organization receives differs in terms of its equivocality. Not all info is created equal. A calendar invite for a 2 p.m. meeting? That's super straightforward. But a client saying we want something that pops? That is incredibly confusing. And third, because of that confusion, organizations must actively engage in information processing. The whole entire point of getting on those calls and sending those messages is to actively reduce that confusion so that some kind of action can actually be taken. And this brings us to the ultimate villain of clarity. Equivocality. Based on the source text, equivocality refers to situations where people face the choice of 2 or more alternative interpretations. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand the difference between plain old uncertainty and true equivocality. If you don't know what time a meeting starts, well, that's just uncertainty. You just lack information and you need someone to tell you the time. Problem solved. But equivocality is different. You might actually have plenty of information, but it can be interpreted in multiple, completely conflicting ways. If a major client calls and says, "just take care of it," what does that mean? Does it mean give them a discount? Does it mean fire the account manager? Or does it mean ignore the problem? That is equivocality. It strikes whenever we are forced to choose between these multiple meanings, and our primary job is to defeat it. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, principles of equivocality. So how does an organization actually fight back against this ambiguity? The theory outlines 3 mechanical principles to get this done. First, an organization has to analyze the equivocality of the incoming information, actively work to remove it, and identify the specific cycles of communication needed to do that. Second, There's this vital balancing act between using rules and using cycles. Let's translate that out of academic speak for a second. Rules are basically your standard operating procedures, your employee handbooks, the way things have always been done. Cycles are real-time communications. That's scheduling a brainstorm, firing off a Slack thread, picking up the phone. If a situation is totally routine, you lean on a rule. But if a situation is completely unprecedented and highly equivocal, you've got to ditch the rulebook and start deploying communication cycles. The organization is constantly balancing these two tools. And the third principle here gives us a highly reliable, brilliant formula. More communication cycles equals less equivocation remaining. When a message is highly equivocal, when it has those multiple confusing interpretations, you absolutely cannot rely on lean communication. There is no way you're resolving a massive crisis with an automated email or a static memo. You have to engage in rich, complex cycles. You need to ask probing questions, gather immediate feedback, and facilitate a real back-and-forth dialogue. The theory states this direct relationship super clearly. The more you use these rich communication cycles to process the confusing information, really hashing it out together, the less equivocation will remain at the end of the process. You are quite literally talking the confusion out of existence. Let's shift gears to section 4, the 3-stage process. Because making sense of chaos isn't just random reactive flailing, right? The source material explicitly identifies reducing equivocation as a highly structured 3-stage process. First up is the recognition stage. This is where the organization actively registers the confusion. Someone basically has to raise their hand and say, wait a second, this client's request makes no sense. There are at least 3 ways to read this. Second is the deployment stage. This is where the organization actually executes those communication cycles we just talked about. The team gets into a room, debates the meanings, shares context, and actively strips away the alternative interpretations. And third is the retention stage. Once the team finally figures out what the confusing message actually meant and how to handle it, they store that new understanding as a rule for the future. By moving through these distinct methodical stages, an organization transforms pure chaos into clear, structured knowledge. Finally, we arrive at section 5, evaluating the theory. Now, to fully grasp any framework, we really have to step back and look at both its strengths and its limitations objectively. In terms of logical consistency, the theory definitely faces some valid critiques. It assumes a certain level of rationality, but let's be real, people aren't always logically guided by rules. Human beings are emotional, we're political, and sometimes we're just inherently irrational. Furthermore, critics point out that organizations aren't these perfect, static units that simply switch between rules and cycles flawlessly. They are messy and constantly shifting. However, looking at the utility of this framework, it is incredibly high. It just so effectively explains the sheer complexities of how modern knowledge workers process information daily. And in terms of heurism, which is its ability to inspire further research, it has been incredibly successful. It's prompted considerable scholarly discussion and has profoundly shaped how experts study organizational communication today. So I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Turn the mirror onto your own workplace right now. Think about the emails, the messages, the urgent, vague requests you received this morning alone. When the information environment gets highly equivocal, how does your team actually respond? Do you recognize the confusion and effectively deploy communication cycles to hash it out? Or are you just barely surviving the chaos, acting on misunderstandings? Understanding Carl Wake's theory gives you a super powerful new perspective. It lets you see that everyday chaos not as a disaster, but as the very reason your organization exists in the first place, to process it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into organizational information theory. Now, get out there and keep communicating to cut through the equivocality.